You are listening to Prevention is the New Cure, all things health and NHS with a political twist.
And that's with me, Dr. Helen Stokes-Lampard, and Steve Bryan MP.
Hello, Helen.
Hi, Steve. Here we are again.
Here we are again. Welcome along to episode 27. We have another guest coming on later who's going to talk about early diagnosis of upper GI cancers. I will let you explain more of what that means. That sort of follows on neatly, Helen. Last week we were talking cancer with Professor Sir Harpal Kumar, who runs Grail Europe and the Gallery trial, particularly, formerly CEO of Cancer Research UK. Do you remember Harpal?
I do. Harpal's great. He's an old friend, and he's involved in such an interesting area of work. And so for what he was talking to us about was multi-cancer detection. So, these panel of tests done on a blood sample looking for little bits of genetic fluid, genetic material circulating in the blood that can be released, that are released by cancers at various stages. So, yeah, really interesting stuff. And it'll be good to hear the big research trial findings from that coming out in the next couple of years. But I think the NHS is going to be making decisions on whether it uses that testing in the near weeks.
Yeah.
But I think you said to explain what's meant by upper GI cancer. So upper GI, basically the top end of your guts as opposed to the bottom end of your guts. So that's anything sort of throat, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, we'd sort of think of as upper GI. So that's the sort of area we're talking about today.
Interesting. All right, more of that to come. And if you want to hear that episode with Harpal Kumar, it's episode 26. So just scroll back on the podcast platform and you'll find it. So have you had a good Easter, Helen?
I've had a lovely Easter, thank you. I have avoided eating too much chocolate. And in fact, we went round to friends for Easter Sunday and I made husband and I made a ridiculously naughty Easter cake, which we took. But we ended up having a fabulous curry for Easter Sunday lunch, which was a novel surprise, but it was wonderful. Yeah. How about you? What did you do over Easter?
Well, I didn't have an Easter egg.
Didn't you?
No, feel sorry for me. Although I did take a bit of the children's Easter eggs. Because I said that it's not like Easter Sunday unless you can dip a bit of chocolate from an Easter egg into a cup of tea. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, Steve, I'm feeling a bit sorry for you.
Yeah, no, well, yeah. It's a cross I had to bear, Helen. But there you go. Yeah, so I had a bit of their Easter egg. The only Easter egg that I didn't have a bit of was Monty's, who, as you know, is my black Labrador, who had a lovely, lovely egg. Really enjoyed it.
He's not supposed to eat chocolate, Steve. He's a dog.
No, they're from Pets at Home.
Oh, a dog chocolate.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I loved it.
I was starting to get a little anxious. I thought you were going to tell me he was at the vet.
Yeah, but we didn't have lamb either, actually, because I've sort of taken against lamb because I was out for a walk with said Monty the other day and he saw some very small newborn lambs in a field and had a bit of a moment sort of chatting to one over a gate. And I thought they looked quite sweet. And so I just thought it looked really bad.
Can I just say that curry I had was a lamb curry and it was awesome. Sorry.
Well, let it be on your conscience, Helen. That's all I'm saying. Yeah, so Easter was good. I played golf, actually. Don't often get to play golf. Played golf on Easter Saturday in the sunshine. Wasn't it lovely? Easter sunshine?
Do you know it didn't last very long around here? It was a short bit of sunshine and then anyway, it's rubbish weather in the Midlands. Anyway,
so Steve, coming up.
Your wrist is bandaged up.
Well, I had my brace on my wrist, which is partly to blame. Monty is to blame, actually, because he's such a bad walker he's so, partly golf, but it's him. He's so bad on the lead that he's yanked my wrist again. So yeah, he's looking at me as I say this because he knows it's him. You do know it's you. I know. Anyway, so that's why I've got the brace on my wrist. Anyway, listen, coming up. We're going to talk about the Faculty of Medical Leadership and Management Conference, which you and I both spoke at in Manchester. We're going to talk about a big public attitudes to the NHS survey, which has come out since we last spoke. We're going to talk about assisted dying in Scotland, which has taken an interesting turn. Dog breath. That's not me being rude. We're going to talk about dog breath, Monty. And then we're going to talk briefly about diabetes. So let's start with Manchester and the big conference we were speaking at last week.
Do you know, it was quite an impressive feat that we managed to be speaking at the same conference and not see each other. We managed to not be in Manchester at the same time. So I was opening the conference and you were closing it. But weren't they a fantastic bunch?
Really interesting. Just for people who don't know, because obviously you've known the faculty for a long time and you introduced me to the incredible Rich Withnell who runs it. What is the faculty all about?
Well, it is sort of, as it says on the tin, Faculty of Medical Leadership and Management. They've been going around about 12 years, I think, set up as a way to bring together and improve standards of leadership and management throughout health and care. And Rich Withnell, who is now their chief exec, is an awesome colleague. He's a military medic, GP by background, and all sorts of things in medical education with the Royal College of GPs, but has taken this role on the last year or so. And their chair is another dear friend of mine, the Samaya Lakhani, who's a frontline GP still in Leicester, and he's a former president of the RCGP. So they've got a really interesting model, and they are looking to expand and improve. And actually, I think they want to encourage more people throughout health and care to formally get trained in leadership and management skills. And I think that's probably a good thing. And
So important, yeah.
yeah, you're doing that stuff with the Health Select Committee, aren't you?
Exactly. I mean, and one of the things I was talking about, and I'd close the conference, is this inquiry we're doing called Leadership in the NHS. And it sort of came a bit, I suppose, if you like, off the back of the Lucy Letby trial, when they were talking about clinical leadership versus non-clinical leadership, and one against the other, which I completely disagree with. In acute settings in particular, your clinical and your non-clinical leadership should be as one, but it's all about leadership. And the reason I think, well, I'll try and prove the thesis in our work, one of the reasons why you have such disparate performance across the NHS, with very much the same circumstances, is, I think, down to the way that trusts are led and the way that they're managed. And I'm going to say something controversial now. People say, oh, there's too many managers in the NHS. Actually, I think in some settings, there's not enough management and there's not enough good leadership. And so we're going to be looking at that.
Good. Well, I have to say, one of my bugbears is that we don't value leadership and management sufficiently throughout the health and care. There's this dreadful culture of when clinicians move into the management side of things, they're often seen as going to the dark side and all this nonsense.
Exactly.
When in fact, they're bringing their qualities, their skills and experience to bear in the area where they can have even greater influence. But anyway, good.
Do you know what one of the best things about the conference in Manchester was?
Go on.
I don't know whether you met Daniel. I got to hold a baby.
You got to hold a baby?
Hold a baby called Daniel. He was there with his mummy. And
I heard Daniel when I was speaking. He was.
Oh, you saw him, yeah.
Yeah.
But he was wearing one of those white sleep suits. Those sort of all-in-one sleep suits that they now call a onesie, which babies have worn for years. But yeah, he was like there, and he tried to grab my lanyard, and she said, "Oh, would you like to hold him?" And I was like, "Yes, I would." Not politicians kissing babies, just because you haven't held a baby for ages, and it was great. So watch this space, Helen.
No, Steve.
No, step away from the wife.
Away. Right, move away.
Yes, on sort of linked to what we were saying about leadership and disparate performance around the waiting list and disparate performance around therefore the public's view of the NHS. Since we last spoke, there's been, in fact, it came out the day I was speaking at said conference. The British Social Attitude Survey was put out by the King's Fund and the Nuffield Trust. And for the first time in the 41 years that it's done it, less than a quarter of people say they're satisfied with the way the NHS is running. And of course, there are so many different ways of measuring that particular yard. But I think nearly 3/4, about 71%, they said that it was their dissatisfaction was about long waiting times for GP and hospital appointments. Just over half said that their dissatisfaction was driven by staffing shortages.
Yeah.
Not sure, where the patient's visibility of that would be to come out in a survey, but anyway. And then just under half said that their dissatisfaction came because the government does not, quote, spend enough on the health service. So, I mean, there's so much in there to unpack. We could do a whole podcast on this alone. But, as I was saying on the media on Wednesday morning last week, yeah, it's all very well, isn't it, to kick this around as a political football, but just think of the people working at the front line, like you in the NHS that morning on the bus at 6 a.m. before I'd stirred, how they feel when they hear the organisation that they work for, they work so hard for and give so much to, over and above what they're paid, just to being trashed in this way. And it's a tough message, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you for taking that reflection on Steve. It was a tough message. It was horrible to wake up to. It was one of those you feel sick to the pit of your stomach. But probably the 1.5 million or so people who work within the NHS in England, and then a few 100,000 more who work in the health service in the NHS in the rest of the UK, recognise these challenges completely. We know it takes too long to get appointments. We know waiting lists are too long. We know we haven't got enough staff. We know we need more money. These aren't a shock to us. I think the bits to try and put this in context. This is a public attitude survey. This is not a patient survey. When you survey patients of their individual experience of care, you get much higher responses than these. So these are attitudes that are driven a lot by the media impression, the media interpretation of what the NHS is nowadays. And of course, the media loves to publish bad news stories. It doesn't publish stories saying that, today 1.4 million people will be seen in general practice and will be very happy with the whole range of care that they get. It won't say that hundreds of thousands of people will be seen in A&E departments up and down the country and will receive safe and effective care and lives will be saved as a consequence. It will focus on the fact that people are waiting on trolleys longer than they should, ambulances are queuing outside, and too many patients are delayed getting their cancer tests, all of which are real things, but are only a small part of the story. So the biggest good thing about the public attitude survey is that they've kept the questions the same year after year. So you can look at trends. It's the trends that are the valuable bit to me, as opposed to the absolutes.
How interesting. What a good point. And of course, one of the trends is over 2/3 of those that were asked said that they still want the NHS to be carefree at the point of use. So, the founding principle, the basis on which then, and of course, and their other opinions are available. There are people who disagree with that and say, we just keep pouring money into a system that is failing and people are unhappy with. So why do we just keep doing the same thing? That is a view. And it is, a lot of people have that view. But, the public as a whole, when asked, they support the NHS and they support the principles on which it was founded. And I think long may that continue.
Amen to that. Right.
Yeah.
Dying, Steve.
Yeah. Well, interesting. I noticed this. So obviously we did our big assisted dying report on the select committee that came out 6 weeks or so ago. One of the things that we said in that report, which did not come down one way or the other, the government should change the law in the UK or in England, but we did say, and there's a guide, it's hopefully a guidebook for future debate and future legislation. There's a debate at the end of April in Parliament on the subject, because the petition it's going to be on the 29th of April.
Yeah, okay.
The petition has raised enough signatures for there to be a debate. But one of the things we said in the report was there are other parts of the Crown dependency, if you like, other parts of the jurisdiction of these islands that may well decide under their devolved powers to change the law. And that could be Scotland, it could be the Isle of Man, it could be Jersey. All of those three are currently considering some legislation. And I think you raised this because there is a draft assisted dying for terminally ill adults Scotland bill was published last week.
Yeah, absolutely. And it made some headlines, and I thought it was important to keep this one on our agenda because, we talk about prevention. Prevention of suffering is part of our agenda, and provision of high quality palliative care is hugely important to me as a frontline GP. One of my lines when I'm teaching newer doctors is, when we get end of life care right for families and individuals, the families never forget. When we get it wrong, they never forgive us as an NHS. When we get end of life care badly wrong, and I've seen many examples of good deaths, and I've seen a few examples of bad deaths in my experience. And so I think every healthcare professional is very interested in this. Yeah, as you said, Jersey are already well underway. That's coming in, I think, next year. I think the first cases will be starting. I think Isle of Man have got proposals on the table, but I'm not sure on timing of that. But I was quite surprised to see Scotland have actually accelerated their process. And if this goes through, it's going to end up in a full debate in the autumn. So I think that'll be a big step forward. And if Scotland goes, then England will follow.
It's what we said in our report, is that, obviously it is down to Westminster Parliament as to what happens around health policy in England, but others may make a decision that then impacts on England. And the UK government needs to be prepared for that, should that happen. And, we look forward to their response to our report. Now, not being rude, dog breath.
Back at you. You're the one with the dog on your feet.
I am, yes. Well, exactly. Dogs can tell if someone's stressed based on our breath.
Yeah, this is fascinating. We've heard stories over the years, haven't we? That dogs can diagnose bladder cancer, dogs can diagnose this and that. But
The medical detection dogs.
yeah, there are chemicals secreted, organic compounds in our breath that dogs, or as you know, have got fantastically sensitive noses, can pick up on. But this really surprised me. PTSD detection in people's breath. What do you know about it, Steve?
Well, I know I visited medical detection dogs when I was the minister, and absolutely incredible. And they sniff urine samples and give an early detection that, cancer may need to be followed up. But this one, as you say, is about PTSD, mental health condition caused by what, stressful or frightening or disturbing events that people relive and flash back to. And during the study, 26 people, more than half of whom met the requirements for PTSD, were asked to breathe into a face mask while recalling past traumatic events. And but the dogs that managed to do the detection were a golden retriever and a German shepherd. They were the only two dogs out of the 25 dogs that were able to tell the difference between stressed and non-stressed samples. So cover your ears, Monty. Golden retriever and German shepherd took the top prize there.
But actually, that's really important too, because you can't, people sometimes get excited about these things and think all dogs can be trained to do this stuff. And of course they can't. Some have got very good sensitive noses and some haven't. So yeah, interesting. Let's watch. I mean, I'm sure we'll get proper research coming through on it again, but it caught our eye, didn't it?
Yeah. And then just a final one before we introduce the guest. I thought this was really interesting yesterday in the news. Diabetes patients to be offered artificial pancreas technology. Now, this is about people with type 1 diabetes going to be offered this new technology, which is sort of called an artificial pancreas, to help them manage the condition. Now, what do you know about this one, Doctor?
So artificial pancreas has been discussed for many, many years, and there are some assistive technologies that literally take blood out of the system, filter it, put it back, and so on. But this isn't related to that. This is actually about insulin pump delivery and constant, continuous monitoring of the glucose levels in the blood. So you use a glucose sensor. We talked about these glucose sensor patches that people have been wearing for some time that you can connect to an app on your mobile phone. But this connects the constant monitoring of your glucose to an insulin pump, so you get gradual, steady release of insulin as opposed to you self-injecting boluses of it. So it's a logical thing to do. It makes sense, and I'm actually delighted to see that the NHS is now bringing this in. I think it's going to be a long time before it's widely available. It's going to be a few years, I think, before the NHS can roll this out to all people with type 1 diabetes. But yeah, it's fab.
Interesting. Well, if you're interested in the story, Nick Triggle, who's a very good health correspondent at the BBC, Nick's written quite a lot about this research that's come out of NHS England and BBC Research, so you can Google that. Anyway, let's take a break and then we'll introduce the guest. Welcome back. You are listening to Prevention is the New Cure, the podcast, all things health and politics. And we have a really interesting guest on today, Helen. We have Marcel Gehrung, who is co-founder and chief executive officer of Sighted Health. Now, Sighted Health, Marcel can tell us all about what they do, but basically their mission, if you want to put it that way, is to save lives through early disease detection, endoscopic diagnostic technology. And that's what we're all about, right? We're about saving lives. We're about prevention of ill health. And Marcel, welcome to the podcast.
And yeah, huge welcome from me, Marcel. Yeah, no, huge welcome
Helen.
from me, Marcel. Lovely to meet you for the first time. Interesting surname. Tell me, Gehrung, where's that all about?
Actually, the surname comes from miter joints. So the saw which is being used to saw a miter joint, so two pieces of wood together and align them on a miter angle. The literal German word for this is a Gehrung saw, which is used to create a miter joint. So
fantastic. So
yeah.
do you come from a long line of people who are handymen, or were you a craftsman yourself, or is it you've no idea where it came from, really?
I unfortunately have no idea where it comes from. I was told as a child what it means, and since then I've carried that with me. But unfortunately, anything before that.
So many metaphors you could use though with a miter joint, sort of for fitting things for the best optimum angles, precision working. I love it. I'm a bit of a DIY buff, so yeah. Anyway, sorry, moving on.
Well, that is random. But anyway, welcome. Nice to have you on. We should say at the front, shouldn't we, that the reason that we met, Marcel, is that I brought a couple of members of the select committee to Sighted Health near Cambridge a couple of months ago, and I said, would you come on the podcast and talk about it? And and you beautifully lied and said you listened to us, or maybe you have once. But you clearly need to get out more. But anyway, joking apart, we loved our visit, and so for the people listening, tell us in a nutshell I said what the mission was, but what exactly is the product that you are mostly pushing?
Yes, so Sight Health is a spin-out from Cambridge. We started around 4 years ago, and the core technology and product we're working with is a minimally invasive cell collection platform that enables you to collect cells from the upper part of the digestive tract, so particularly the stomach and the esophagus. And then we have developed the biomarker platform on the back end of that, which we can use to, on the one hand side, detect precancer of the esophagus, but also monitor patients with Barrett's esophagus, which is this precancerous lesion in the esophagus, and basically triage their risk to identify the ones who are at highest risk of progressing to cancer in the future. We're now applying the same technology in non-oncology indications and areas in inflammatory diseases. But Steve, to sort of wrap that up, the company is all about how do we get cells minimally invasively from the upper digestive tract, and how do we interrogate those cells with the right biomarkers to answer very meaningful clinical questions.
Oh my goodness! So how then? We were talking about this before we had you on. How exactly are you collecting these spells? Because I was saying last week when we were talking about you coming on that Marcel's going to come on and talk about his sponge, and that's effectively what it is, right? It's a sponge technology that draws cells. Exactly how does that work though?
Yeah, so the sponge is obviously a means to an end, but how it works is you essentially have a small multivitamin-sized, pill-sized capsule, which is attached to a very sort of fine surgical thread that is ingested by patients just with a glass of water. It basically travels down the esophagus into the stomach. It sits there for 7 minutes. There's a coating around the abrasive sponge that then can dissolve. It takes around 7 minutes while it sits in the stomach, and then that's withdrawn in a very, very swift motion. It takes around 1 to 2 seconds, and on the way up, that abrasive sponge very gently collects and lifts up a superficial layer of cells from the entire length of the upper GI tract, and then afterwards it just goes into a preservative solution, and it's shipped to our lab where we then do all of the analysis.
So I've heard about this from patients, because there's a variety of these sponge technologies out there, aren't there? I mean, I've never seen it actually happen to a patient. So you swallow the capsule, fine wire attached to it, wait until the coating dissolves, it expands, you pull it out, it brings cells with it. So yes, as a doctor, that strikes me as having the advantage that it drags cells from the whole length of the tract of the esophagus, as opposed to where you would biopsy by eye if you were going down with an endoscope. And I mean, also, I've seen plenty of people having endoscopies and how they gag and retch and so on. In terms of, I'm assuming the pulling out isn't terribly pleasant, but it's very quick. How do people cope having the fine wire down, or the fine thread down? Does that irritate, or it's only for 7 minutes?
I think when I did it the first time a few years ago, I in being asked afterwards, I used the analogy of, and don't know what any one of you did as a child, but in Germany it was pretty common to play around with spaghetti and basically have the sensation of spaghetti basically being stuck in your throat. It is a very, very thin sort of silicone coated thread, which is it has very low friction, and it slips very easily. So it feels, most patients position it in the middle of their tongue, so it doesn't really touch the back of their throat, where it could get, where it could irritate in some ways. Interestingly, you already said it, Helen. The uncomfortable bit is the 1 or 2 seconds when you withdraw it. We rarely get complaints of patients, that feel the string is too irritating for the 7 minutes while they're sitting there. Most patients are even, cheerful enough that they can just talk while having the procedure. So they speak to the nurse, they speak to the doctor who carries out the procedure, and then they just have to go through that 1 second at the end where you have this. I mean, I think all of us are probably very, very aware of this. That's the reason why it's uncomfortable is actually not because it's painful, because it's an uncommon sensation for all of us. Very rarely there's a solid piece of something coming up the other way again. But in this case, it's compressible. It's a very, very gentle sponge material. So you only really feel it when it passes through your throat region for, a split second. And most patients, by the time they've realized it's already out and it's over.
That is super. And I have to say, I mean, presumably then you don't need as much medical expertise or seniority because there's lower risk because you're not sticking sharp things down. It's blood, it's soft.
Correct. Yes, we have done this and we've demonstrated that you can do this in a community setting. Obviously, primary care, we've done it many times over now, but really now working on a pharmacy delivery model where potentially this could evolve into being part of the Pharmacy First program at some point down the line, and we're working on a project separately to see how. And I think you as a GP, you're being very familiar with that set of conditions between reflux and dyspepsia. I think the nuance matters really, and making sure that the right patients are seen by the right person at the right time. And that the right people are getting referred for an endoscopy. But for this big population of reflux patients, that don't really have dyspepsia symptoms, this is a perfect technology which can avoid an endoscopy for them. Or if they would never receive an endoscopy in the first place, get a test in an outpatient primary or community care setting, and then only get an intervention and follow up when it's really necessary.
It's amazing. And I suppose presumably any discomfort has to be weighted against having a traditional endoscopy, which presumably is more invasive and more uncomfortable.
Correct. And I think if you put it against what we're trying to prevent from progressing towards in the long run, esophageal cancer, I think we all know esophageal cancer is one of the cancers with the lowest or with the poorest outcomes in the UK. It has one of the lowest survival rates, less than 15% over a 5-year period after diagnosis. And very often it's diagnosed at stage 3, stage 4 disease. When patients present with trouble swallowing, they already have a large tumor somewhere sitting in the esophagus. But at that point in time, we're usually looking at palliative treatment. We're not looking at curative treatment. But if you find something before it even becomes cancerous, you can monitor these patients much more effectively and never really bother about whether it even becomes stage 1 or stage 2 disease, because you can catch them at every single one of the stages before that.
So on the prevention piece then, which obviously we are primarily interested in, how does the GP or the clinician that you are interacting with, how do they spot the conditions that mean that you may be referred down this path?
So we actually have done quite a bit of work on this in the last 2 years, also with NHS England, on moving the technology out from secondary care to primary care. During COVID, it was used to manage endoscopy waiting lists, basically to identify low to medium risk patients that don't need an endoscopy, that can go down this capsule sponge pathway, and then only if they're positive, they go on to having an endoscopy, or basically join the waiting list in that case. What we then did in primary care, and this is where the technology really came from in the very beginning, is how do we find patients where a GP, for example, you have a patient which is on prolonged heartburn and reflux medication prescriptions, so proton pump inhibitors, which you also can buy over the counter, but obviously also can get a prescription for. How do you identify the people that are on these prolonged prescriptions at massively increased risk to have Barrett's esophagus? But Helen, for example, as a GP, would not consider referring them for an endoscopy because they don't meet the thresholds for that referral. And I think, Helen, I mean, you're the expert in this. The criteria for how GPs in the country refer are I mean, there's nice guidance for this, but it's obviously vastly different. Some people refer pretty much everyone who has a bit of heartburn or reflux for an endoscopy, and some of them don't. And the discrepancy between that and the lack of another test, for example, in the lower GI tract with colon cancer, we have FIT tests,
indeed,
which we can offer to patients, which are, lower. It lowers the access barrier for people to enter that pathway, for patients to enter that pathway. But we don't have anything similar besides medicating patients in the upper GI tract when they have heartburn or GERD. Well,
This is exactly what I'm thinking, because it does sound the sort of test that could be administered in a straightforward way in primary care, but also presumably ultimately you'll look at self-administration. It's pulling it out is the problem, and it's having the confidence to pull the darn thing out, I assume, is the barrier to doing it yourself, as opposed to getting it into the FIT file.
We have explored that route, Helen. I don't think that's going to work, because the challenging thing here is the uncomfortable bit is, as you say, the withdrawal. And if you stop, it gets more uncomfortable. And I think, particularly if you look at the patient population you would be working with here,
I think I was just thinking about the more motivated patients with known Barrett's who need regular monitoring and follow-up, who maybe, but I mean, it's been, once upon a time people said nobody would ever self-inject for insulin either. So it's an interesting one, and it's an aside, but that's my GP brain at work. So Marcel, like the potential is enormous. I think I'm really interested in the evidence bit about it, because as you said, it was used as a sort of step before full endoscopy. Where's the the sort of high level published evidence taking us at the moment? I mean, clearly the NHS wouldn't be using it and equivalent. I know there are other options available, but these wouldn't be in use in the NHS if the evidence wasn't that they were certainly good enough. How does it stack up against a standard endoscopy, with an experienced endoscopist?
So I think the important thing is there is the two different layers of evidence here. One of them is to find patients with more advanced disease than Barrett's esophagus, and the other one is finding patients with Barrett's. Yeah. For finding patients with Barrett's, if you want to look at clinically meaningful or clinically significant Barrett's diagnoses, so when the patient has a certain length of Barrett's segment in the esophagus, sensitivity is around 90%, specificity is somewhere between 92 and 94%, depending on some of the trials we've run. Cancer diagnosis is actually a bit higher than 90%. So in patients with Barrett's, finding dysplasia or cancer, that trends towards the sort of like 93, 94, which is, and the reason why I'm splitting this up, and I think you already asked the right question here, is the nuance on how is it used at what point in the pathway and what are you looking for? Because I remember, in your last episode with Harpal, he actually touched on this, is something is either used in patients where you use it in a sort of targeted screening context, or if you use tests as a triaging tool to refer or to deal with patients that are already symptomatic, it makes a massive difference whether you then have a test that's geared towards high specificity or a test that's geared towards high sensitivity. We have the great situation that we're obviously not dealing with blood, we're dealing with a target sample. So the signal is much, much better than, what you would get in blood from looking at sort of the disease spectrum which we're looking at. But because it's so good on both ends, it can serve both purposes, and it always keeps the specificity very high. And that's key, but it also doesn't sacrifice sensitivity, particularly when it's about triaging patients.
Cool. That's an exciting feature.
How long from it being removed from the patient, the withdrawal of it, how long until the primary care professional or the consultant would have some sort of outcome?
Usually 4 to 5 days, and then whatever it takes them, to obviously communicate that to the patient. And we had some big national evaluation with NHS England, which was published a couple of months ago. And in that evaluation, one of the interesting highlights was that it wasn't actually from a laboratory turnaround time, that wasn't the limiting factor. It was actually the administrative overhead of then, reaching out to the patient again and sharing the results with them, and then thinking what should happen next, and then getting them onto the right pathway as necessary. So there's lots of work we're also now doing on the other end on how to make sure that these results go to patients even quicker, and particularly in a potential pharmacy world where that might be delivered in the future, you can see the patient being a more important intermediate, sort of akin to the American model, where the patient plays a much more central role to driving their own care because they receive a result. And then, like in the pharmacy first model, there's this sort of like shared responsibility and continuum across the pathway. But yeah, we're working on a whole bunch of different things on understanding how we both make patients more aware of it, but then also how are they empowered to go on the right pathway afterwards. Because Barrett's, I mean, Helen, you are again the expert here. We have excellent colon cancer awareness. We have obviously more colon cancer cases than we have in the UK. But if we look at deaths resulting from cancers, then esophageal cancer is trailing not a lot behind colon cancer. But the awareness for it is abysmal.
Very low.
People do not associate GERD, heartburn, reflux symptoms with the likelihood of potentially being at higher risk of developing cancer in the future. So the patient
that's kind of good. Isn't that kind of good and bad? Because you don't want an army of panicked, worried. Well, because I mean, tell us, Helen. There's a lot of people on some kind of PARP inhibitor, isn't there? I mean, omeprazole is probably the most well known for some kind of reflux heartburn. I mean, there's a lot of people on that. It doesn't mean that they've all got something sinister.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember in medical school in a pharmacology lecture being told that the then standard drug, which was ranitidine, proton pump inhibitors, which have now been withdrawn, was the most popular, most commonly prescribed drug in the world, which gives you a sense of scale of acid-related disorders globally. And yeah, I mean, and I had a GP colleague who was a few years older than me. He was about 50, and so I would have been in my early 40s. Him saying, "Well, isn't everybody taking on something for acid medication?" And it was a really interesting thing that his understanding was the normal was that everyone was either taking, Gaviscon or antacid tablets or being prescribed something because of our Western diet and lifestyle means we generate a lot of stomach acid. So yeah, it's a massive issue, Steve. And you're right about not panicking the worried well, but Barrett's esophagus is nasty. And it's one of those that the figures are actually quite variable. I actually checked on the Cancer Research UK website about this. They say between 3 and 13 people in 100 with Barrett's will go on to develop esophageal cancer. So 90% of people basically with Barrett's won't develop disease. But for those who do go on and develop it, this early diagnosis is life-changing. So this is a really exciting development. And I think for me, it's like seeing this in terms of the FIT test as becoming for colorectal cancer, is that screening test we can do in the community to then fast track people into the right test with a specialist who can take it further.
Well, anyway, it's we were saying to Harpal, I mean, it's another tool in the box, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So you mentioned in your last answer about both NHS England and you mentioned the US, and I know that you work obviously in this country and you're based here in Cambridge, which is great, or near Cambridge, but you also do work across the pond in the US. Give us a sense of where the challenges are within the publicly funded health system that is the NHS, and budgets and challenges that you may have here versus the expansion and how easy or otherwise it is in the US.
Yeah, I think there's a number of different dimensions to that, but let me actually go sort of in reverse order on that question. One of the things we've discovered very early on when looking at the US market is that there's a large group of clinicians where reducing what they currently do is not necessarily in their interest. So let's say, for a lot of, and I hope not too many of our American audience or sort of like stakeholders are tuning in on this, but I think there's this interesting tension in the US that, let's say, if you have a technology that reduces endoscopies, there's not that many gastroenterologists that necessarily want to have that, because endoscopies for most GI practices in the US are big revenue drivers. Right. So finding something that offsets that, even though it might be more comfortable to the patient, doesn't always work as well as people would think. That being said, and I have to qualify that here, that is radically changing in the US currently, but it's a big change. So we're moving from a fee-for-service world in the US towards which is much more value-based oriented, which is obviously what we want to do here in the UK. And, we do that very well in some areas. I don't think we do that as well in certain others. But, where it all should be driven by cost effectiveness, demonstrating outcomes, reducing morbidity and mortality with these tests or obviously treatments. But it's one of the big things, and I think, Steve, is the cultural shift of having piloted and actually having gotten to a very, very good adoption and implementation stage in the NHS, and then trying to lift and shift that blueprint to the US and actually and not doing that at the same time, because there's a lot of wrong assumptions which you would lift over, which you do not want to apply in the US because they simply don't apply. So as I said, the dynamics of reducing procedure volumes or understanding how a clinician wants to use this and how a patient then would ask for it on the back of it, it's just very, very different. So one of the main things we have to tackle here is our own bias from having learned how a value-based care system in the UK does that, and then how you translate it into the US. And very often, and I don't want to go on a big tangent, very often a lot of particularly the investor community, when you take technologies or companies that go from this side of the Atlantic to the US, that is often the big things they struggle with and fail, because they just think, well, first of all, the US is a big market, so we have to go there. That's true. Okay, that's true for most life sciences companies that want to go after a big commercial market. But then the other thing is they apply the same things they've learned in Europe and then try to apply them in the US, and they don't account for the cultural differences and the behavioral and healthcare practice differences. So obviously they look after patients in a reasonably similar way, but the way how they're doing that and why they're motivated to do it is very, very different. So there's a big piece of work, and we now have a team in the US that obviously brings that expertise into the company. So we're not just sending 10 people from the UK over and try to get it right the first time. So we rely on country experience, but that's certainly one of the things we're tackling there. But we can dive into any level of detail.
It's good
there.
stuff, isn't it, Helen?
Yeah, Marcel, it's really fascinating. And I think you've just beautifully highlighted the challenges of different healthcare systems and the way they're funded. I'm a bit conscious of your time, Marcel, and it is Easter week. Steve, any last questions for Marcel?
Well, they've won some awards, haven't you? I mean, you won an HSJ award, didn't you, last month? So I think you were nominated for a lot of them, weren't you? So congratulations on that. So it's getting recognised both in the scientific community and in the wider community. And I think if people want to find you, it's Cyted Health on X, and Cyted, CYTED is how it's spelled. So cytedhealth.com. Where next for the business, because it's just such a go ahead, it's such a go-getting business. I really enjoyed our visit.
Yes, where next for us? We're having quite a few very, very interesting things in the pipeline around basically exploring the digestive tract beyond what we're currently doing. That's what I can tell you both about it. I think we all know what that means, but I think we have become experts at minimally invasive cell collection and then, answering the right questions with biomarkers. So, the esophagus is stage one, and we're working on a number of different things there.
I love it. And just finally, because you're from Stuttgart, aren't you, originally?
I am, yes.
Now, what's all this stuff I keep reading, Marcel, about Germany's legalizing a part of cannabis, and apparently it's going to become a weed tourist hub in Europe? What do you reckon? Do you think I should pop over?
Good question.
Why are they doing it? Why are they doing it now in Germany? Well, one of the most conservative states in the Union, you would think. Why are they doing something that you would more associate maybe with Holland or some US states? Why do you think they're doing that?
Several different things. So first, actually, what is the state now? So the state now is, as of 2 days ago, obviously we have a partial decriminalization of cannabis in Germany. What that means is that actually you can't buy cannabis currently. So there's no way to buy cannabis for 2 days. In this current phase, there's no plan for that either. Currently, the only thing which it's legalized, not decriminalized, but legalized to possess cannabis, to grow cannabis at home, and to consume cannabis. And that is very, very, very. There's some very, very strong guardrails around where that is allowed to happen. It's, for example, you can't do it in pedestrian zones. You're only allowed to do it at home on private property. So the news headlines are one thing, but actually the details are a slightly different one. Okay. There are going to be phase 2 and phase 3 of that in the future. Phase 2 is that you're going to have these cannabis clubs, Steve, which you're more than welcome to join on one of your many trips to Germany.
Cannabis clubs, my goodness.
Cannabis clubs, yeah, that's what they're called. Where you have a certain member limit, and then you can acquire cannabis via these clubs. And then in the last stage, they want to look at how to enable retail cannabis disposal, which is a long journey until then. And I think, to your point, Steve, on the current government in Germany that has come up with this, they obviously, particularly with the Conservative Party being in the opposition for the last few years, there's a lot of scrutiny, which obviously all of this went under, and a lot of concessions which had to be made. So the original legalization bill and approach was, getting it into retail and completely legalizing it. Now we've ended up in this odd hybrid situation where you're allowed to have it, you're allowed to consume it at home, you're not allowed to consume it like within a certain distance limit of children and teenagers, and a lot of qualifications that obviously come with it. But I think it has been something where, and I don't want to go overly political on this one, because it's really intriguing when you look at the political landscape in Germany. But the party that now, as Olaf Scholz's party, the SPD, they always struggle they always had to reinvent themselves. So the Labour Party in Germany, they really struggle to reinvent themselves with, taking strong policy positions in the last 10 years. And this seems to be something where, the population between 18 and 35 and 40 felt strong about, in the last election cycle. And therefore they said, we're going to legalize it. And now they have sort of like done the 20% job of that and probably left the other 80% to whoever's going to be in charge next in Germany. I think that's the in a nutshell answer.
Whatever
that is a
next.
Fantastic answer. Thank you, Marcel. That's helped me hugely. I don't know about you, Steve, but
I loved it. Yeah, I just loved it. I mean, I just love the SciTED. I love the project. I love what you're doing. I mean, it's giving. It just we talked last week, didn't we, with Harpel and Grail about sliding doors moments and people who, by any measure shouldn't really have made it. And, if you're talking about finding very early stage esophageal cancer, wow, just wow.
And as the voice of balance, other products are available, but I also think it's an awesome concept and real step forward. So Marcel, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast.
Marcel, thanks for coming on. Next time you're home as a Spurs fan, could you find Harry Kane and just tell him to come home?
I will. Like on my next trip to Munich, I will try.
That'll be great. Yeah, I'll leave that one with you. Homework. Okay. Thanks for coming on. Really great to see you.
Take care. Bye, Marcel.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Helen. Bye.
Welcome back to this. Steve, it's pod surgery time again. Wasn't that great with Marcel?
It was great with Marcel. Can I just say before we do pod surgery that of all the guests we've ever had on, Marcel had the best hair. Tidiest hair. Very tidy hair.
Yeah, but I asked him about his hair actually because it was so sharp. Turns out he's got a 3-month-old baby and he's only just got to the barber a few days ago for the first time since baby was born. So perhaps if we'd interviewed him last week, it would have been different.
He's spent some time in there, hasn't he? He's decided he's overspent time in there to make the most of his time away. One of the chaps I played golf with on Saturday has got a 4-month-old baby, and he said, "Oh, well, while I'm all the way down here, maybe we should just do another 9 this afternoon." And I said, "I think you'll be pushing your luck." He was enjoying his time out.
Anyway, look, we should wrap up soon because we've definitely overstayed our time today, and I have to go and pick my parents up. But they're coming to stay with us for a few days after Easter, which I'm
give them my regards.
I will. They are both keen listeners of the podcast. Steve, I have seen an interesting story. Did you pick up this story about head injuries and depression?
Perinatal depression?
Not perinatal depression. This is about severe head injury.
No, I didn't know. Educate me.
So, have you ever come across somebody who's had a serious, severe brain injury?
Yes.
Okay, so do you remember what they were like before and after, or did you just know them after the injury?
No, just after. So I obviously met quite a lot of people throughout the time as a minister, and actually going into the criminal justice system over the years, with a lot of people who've had some kind of brain injury, who are in the criminal justice system, rather tragically, actually. So yeah, not usually the before and after. So
look, I obviously in my job, I've come across many people over the years, and there's a very well recognized pattern. If you have a very severe brain injury, people very commonly have a very different personality after they recover. And now clearly they've gone through a horrific, traumatic situation, which is life-changing. But actually, there are some fundamental changes that seem to happen within the brain, the way the brain is wired, which can change personality. And there is a very, very high association with people who've had a traumatic brain injury developing depression afterwards. And I just spotted, it was on the BBC, covered it yesterday, that they are doing a big trial. NIHR in the UK is funding a huge trial across 9 trauma centres of giving people antidepressants very early in their recovery to see if it reduces the depression elements of change following head injury. And that struck me. These antidepressants are very inexpensive, very widely prescribed anyway. And to see if by getting in early, it can modify the chances of getting depression. So that was the prevention angle.
Interesting. So sertraline, I think the study talked about, didn't it? Yeah, no, it is really interesting. And I now you say it, I did catch a bit of it on social media, and there's various case studies, isn't there, of people. So I think it was an 18-month trial that they did over there in the US, and people at King's College London have been involved with it. Now, really, really interesting. If you want more on that, we'll pop the link on our social media. But it's I think it's JAMA Psychiatry, JAMA. If you Google JAMA Network in the US, you'd find it. But we'll post the link to the full piece of work on the socials.
We better wrap up today, Steve. But it's been great to see you.
We had, yes. So SciTED is an incredible piece of work, isn't it? And his hair aside, what an impressive man Marcel is.
Yeah, it was fab. Really enjoyed it. Thanks
Doing
again.
really good things. Yes, God bless. Say hi to your parents, and you can find this podcast on social media and across all the different platforms. And remember to like us on whichever platform you get your podcasts. And until next time, goodbye.
Bye-bye.